Hello, everybody. We're going to go on to chapter 10, which is the muscular system. So if you look at this in your book, it can be a bit intimidating, just given how many muscles there are in the body. I do not want you guys to focus on memorizing every single muscle in the body. Kind of like I said in the skeletal system chapter, I don't expect you to know every single bone or every single muscle. I would encourage you to go through and review the different muscles, especially the ones that are located in the major muscle groups in your chapter, just so that you can at least familiarize yourself with them a little bit. So it's not like a completely foreign word or concept to you. But I certainly will not test you on memorizing specific muscles. So what I really will test you on and want you to make sure you know is the physiology side of things. Kind of, I'll point out as we go, but for the most part, it's kind of the first 2/3 of this PowerPoint. And you'll see a slide later on that shows you what pages I do not want you to worry about as much in your book. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, the first 2/3 definitely really key into because that's what a majority of test questions are going to come from. So the different types of muscle. So we'll start with cardiac muscle. It's called cardiac muscle because it can only be found in the heart. It's involuntary, meaning that it kind of beats on its own. We don't consciously think about activating our cardiac muscle. It appears striated, which means striped, and it's made up of really short fibers that are connected with what are known as intercalated discs. So in the heart, it's very important that all the muscle contracts together so that we get a smooth heartbeat. And so the intercalated discs help the signal spread evenly so that the heart works as a team. Okay, smooth muscle is called smooth muscle because it's non-striated, so there's no stripes here. This again is involuntary. We don't consciously activate our smooth muscle. It's found in areas that kind of need to keep food or stuff moving, like your digestive tract, blood vessels, your bladder, airways, your uterus is another example. And then skeletal muscle, this will be our main focus and what we talk about for the most part, because it actually causes the movement of our body. And so obviously this is voluntary. We can decide when we want to move our finger or our leg or whatever it may be. And this is also striated. So under a microscope, you will get that striped appearance. All right, we're going to get into the muscle structure initially. So we'll kind of start super small and build on that. So a muscle cell is known as a muscle fiber. So that's this inner portion here. And so each fiber is covered by endomysium. So that's that first covering. So endo means inner. So a muscle fiber is covered by the endomysium. So these fibers group up, it's kind of a bundle of them, and these groups are known as fascicles. So a group of muscle fibers, this middle picture here is a fascicle, and it's held together with perimysium. So the perimysium is the outer covering of the fascicle. So these fascicles then form groups, and they're surrounded by the epimysium. So the epi, which is outer, is the outer covering there. And then outside of the muscle itself, we also still have fascia. So this deep fascia is these kind of gray areas through here. It's between the muscles. And then you have superficial fascia, which is another name for our hypodermis, and that primarily contains adipose cells. So muscle fiber is the smallest unit, and that's covered by endomysium. A fascicle is a group of fibers, that's covered by the perimysium, and then the muscle as a whole is covered by the epimysium. Okay, so muscle fibers are somewhat similar to other cells in terms of the organelles and kind of components of them. They're just named a little bit differently. So the prefix or root word for muscle is this sarco. So a lot of, you'll see this in a lot of the organelle names as well. So the first one we'll talk about is the sarcolemma, and that's the plasma membrane that surrounds each fiber. So just to orient you guys, now we're super zoomed in. So we're zoomed in even more on the muscle fiber. So we're talking even smaller scale. So this outer covering is your sarcolemma. That's your plasma membrane. And then the cytoplasm in the muscle fiber is known as the sarcoplasm. And so the muscle fiber is made up of long protein bundles known as myofibrils, and those fill up the sarcoplasm and they store glycogen, which can be converted to glucose for energy, and oxygen, which we also need to run our energy reactions. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, so that's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of a muscle fiber. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum surrounds the myofibril, and they store calcium ions. And calcium ions are very important for muscle contraction, and we'll get into that whole process a little bit later on. So zooming even further in on the myofibrils, we talk about myofilaments. So there's two types. There's thick, which is known as myosin, and there's thin, which is known as actin. And the way these are arranged within the muscle fiber actually allows the contraction to occur, and it's what gives it the striated appearance. Last piece in here is the T tubules, or the transverse tubules. And so they extend across the whole sarcoplasm and go farther into the cell. And so the purpose for them is to allow the electrical impulse to spread deeper into the cell versus having to go from the surface farther in. Okay, so now we're talking about the muscle filaments. These are the myofilaments. So our thick filaments are myosin. So we have hundreds of myosin molecules stacked together. And this is what one looks like. It has a long tail, which makes up the bundle. And then you see this globular shaped head, or like a golf club shaped head. Our thin filaments are actin. So that's made up of two actin chains. And you'll also find troponin and tropomyosin on the actin strands. Okay, so a single muscle cell is called a myofilament, B muscle fiber, C myofibril, or D fascicle. So take a second to think about this one. And the correct answer is B muscle fiber. So muscle fiber and muscle cell are synonymous. Myofibrils are smaller scale than the fibers. That's what fills the sarcoplasm. Myofilaments are even smaller than the myofibrils, so that's our actin and myosin. And then those fibers are grouped into bundles. That's what we consider a fascicle. Okay, so zooming in on the myofibril. So this is kind of a functional unit of the muscle. It has our sarcomere, our Z discs, and then you can see the thin lines are your actin. The thick lines are your myosin. And so looking down here, you see myosin, actin. So you'll see they're partially overlapping here, but they're not actually connected. And so that means they're relaxed. So this is just how kind of a normal resting state of the muscle. So when we actually go to contract, what happens is the kind of the golf club shaped head of the myosin is able to grab on to binding sites in the actin, and that bind is known as a cross bridge. And so once it grabs onto the actin, it can pull, and so your Z discs get closer together, and that causes your sarcomere to shorten. And so that chain kind of continues onto a larger scale. And so the shortening of the sarcomeres throughout the muscle results in the shortening of the muscle itself. And so kind of the grab and the pull is known as the sliding filament model of contraction. The sliding filament model of contraction, because your actin and your myosin are sliding. So like I said, just to highlight again, this bridge itself, or this bond, is the cross bridge. And then when it makes its pull, that's known as a power stroke. So to go back up to the bigger picture here, I didn't go through these specifically. The Z disc itself is basically an anchor point for the actin, and then in between the Z disc is known as the sarcomere. So from here to here is your sarcomere. And these are kind of together in chains and make up the muscle fiber. Okay, so we just talked about this a little bit. So the Z disc or Z lines, those are the same thing, are your anchors for your thin myofilaments, actin. And then the sarcomere is where the actual contraction occurs. So we said resting position, there's partial overlap, but no attachment. And then the myosin attaches to the actin when it's time to actually get a contraction. So the myosin forms a cross bridge with the actin, and then there's a series of power strokes for the contraction. And that kind of just talks about and puts into words what we already talked about. So as I said, the Z discs are the anchors. So when the myosin pulls it in, it's going to go towards the center of the sarcomere. And so the Z discs are also pulled closer together as that sarcomere shortens. And then, like I said, this is kind of a chain reaction from the microscopic level to the full muscle. Okay, so for a contraction to actually occur, the muscle itself has to be stimulated by a motor neuron. And so these motor neurons have axons that extend out from the cell body of the neuron, and these branches go to different muscle fibers. Some of the muscle and motor neurons have tons of axons and innervate a ton of different muscle fibers, and some only innervate just a very few muscle fibers. So it varies based on motor neuron. And then your neuromuscular junction, that's where there's an actual connection between your motor neuron and a muscle fiber. And even though we consider it a connection, they're actually not touching. There's a small space between the end of that nerve and the start of the muscle fiber. And that small space is known as our synaptic cleft. And we're going to talk about the role that that plays in our muscle contraction. Okay, so step by step here, this picture is on page 155 in your book if you want to look at it from there. So just to orient you guys, this is the axon of the motor neuron. That's the ending. This space here is your synaptic cleft before you get to the actual muscle fiber. All right, so what happens is an impulse reaches the end of the motor neuron, and that causes the motor neuron to release a neurotransmitter, which is basically a signaling chemical. And in this case, it releases acetylcholine. ACH is the abbreviation for that. And that acetylcholine then goes into the synaptic cleft. So it quickly passes through the synaptic cleft, and there's receptors on each muscle cell's sarcolemma. So remember, that's your plasma membrane of the muscle cell. So the ACH connects to the receptors on the sarcolemma, and that results in an electrical impulse spreading across the sarcolemma and also down through the T tubules. That electrical impulse then stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And if you remember from our actin picture, there's troponin on there. And so the calcium binds with that troponin, and that's what actually reveals the attachment site so that the myosin head can form its cross bridge with the actin. So let's go through that one more time. So impulse sent from the brain to a motor neuron. That causes the release of acetylcholine or ACH. That's considered a neurotransmitter. It diffuses through the synaptic cleft to the receptors on the sarcolemma. The receptors binding with ACH trigger an electrical impulse to travel across the sarcolemma and through the T tubules. That electrical impulse then causes your sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. That calcium binds with troponin, and the myosin can now form a cross bridge with the actin. This just takes you through the kind of an actual animation of what we just discussed step by step. All right, muscle relaxation, on the other hand, is when the nerve impulses stop So once those stop, so does the release of acetylcholine. Just because acetylcholine is no longer being released actively does not mean that all of it is gone from the synaptic cleft. So an enzyme known as acetylcholinesterase, so it erases the acetylcholine, breaks down any of the acetylcholine remaining in the cleft. The calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So once the cell or fiber has no calcium available, then there's no open sites for the myosin to form a cross bridge with. So troponin needs calcium to get out of the way. Okay, muscle tone. So we talked about earlier that there's partial overlap with the myosin and the actin at rest. And so they're not necessarily completely contracting, but they're also not 100% relaxed. And this is known as muscle tone, and we maintain it because it gives us better reaction times. It allows some of our reflexes to work quickly. If we had to wait for kind of everything to wake up before we could move, we wouldn't really be able to move super quick when we need to. And so that optimal resting length and how our body is at rest is known as muscle tone. So if you have overly contracted sarcomeres or overly stretched sarcomeres, that results in a very weak contraction. And we'll talk about a couple of examples and why that is the case. So this whole concept of the optimum resting length and this over or under contracted is known as the length tension relationship. So if we're overly contracted, the sarcomeres are already very, very short. So there's really not much more space for the myosin to pull the actin before they run into the Z discs. So that results in a weak contraction. If it's too stretched, there's not enough of an overlap of the actin and myosin. So that means there's only a few of the myosin heads that can actually form their cross bridge. So again, leads to a pretty weak contraction. So this optimum resting length is kind of an ideal balance between the myosin having plenty of heads to make cross bridges and there being enough space between the Z disc and the myosin for contraction to actually occur. All right, question 2. During muscle contraction, the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases which substance? Is it A, calcium, B, acetylcholine, C, ATP, or D, acetylcholinesterase? And the correct answer there is A, calcium. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's released by your motor neuron across the synaptic cleft. Muscle contraction does use ATP, but not from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then acetylcholinesterase is that enzyme that erases the acetylcholine, breaks down the extra acetylcholine when your muscle is relaxing. Okay, talking a little bit more about the contraction of a muscle. So you have your motor unit, that's the neuron and all the fibers that it stimulates. So your motor neuron is the neuron itself. The motor unit is that neuron plus all the fibers that it stimulates. And so as I said before, they can be just a few fibers included in the unit, or it could be hundreds and hundreds of fibers. So you can think of our nerve working basically kind of like as an electrical system and signal. And so our neurons have a threshold that's the minimum voltage needed to cause muscle fiber contraction. Let's just use, for example, say we need 50 volts of a signal for our nerve to fire. So that means if we get a signal that's only 20, 30, 40 volts down the nerve, it's not going to actually cause a contraction. A twitch is a single brief contraction, so just one quick contraction. And so the strength of the contraction is influenced by a few things. A big one is the size of the muscle, the degree of stretch because of our length tension relationship that we just went over, and the number of muscle fibers contracting. So we don't always recruit every single muscle fiber in a muscle. All right, there's a few other factors such as frequency of the stimuli or frequency of our nerve signal. how strong that nerve signal is, and then there's also a few different types of contraction. All right, so we're going to talk about stimulus frequency, and there's a few different concepts that go along with this. And so our first one is known as treppe, or the staircase phenomenon, and it's caused by an increased concentration of calcium. So when our muscle contracts several times in a row, the sarcoplasmic reticulum doesn't have time to absorb all the calcium that it pumped out in between contractions. So as our concentration of calcium goes up within the muscle fibers and muscle, then we get a stronger contraction. And so it builds upon each other. That's why they consider it a staircase, because it gets stronger and stronger. Another concept is incomplete tetanus. And so again, in this one, each kind of subsequent contraction is stronger than the one before it. And this time it's because the fibers don't have a chance to actually relax. So the contractions build on each other. So rather than it being the treppe or the staircase that we see with calcium, when we talk about the actual fibers having time to relax, we're talking about incomplete tetanus. And so you can also have complete tetanus, where the muscle fibers don't relax at all between stimuli. And so it just becomes one long contraction of the same strength or level. And so this is called complete tetanus. So the only difference between incomplete and complete is that in incomplete, each one gets stronger as it goes, and the muscle is at least relaxing a tiny bit. In complete tetanus, there's absolutely no relaxation between the stimuli. Okay, strong stimulus or weak stimulus. So the stronger the stimulus, the more muscle fibers and motor units that are going to be recruited. And so I say recruited because the process of increasing the amount of motor units that we're asking to work is known as recruitment. And so in this example, a strong stimulus may get every single fiber to turn on, while a weak one may only get a few to turn on. Okay, the two different types of contraction that we'll talk about is an isometric versus isotonic. So in an isometric contraction, the length of the muscle stays the same. So if he was holding this weight, he's just keeping his forearm perfectly level. It's not going up, it's not coming down. So the tension in the muscle increases, but the length remains the same. In an isotonic contraction, you can see he's actually moving the weight. So our muscle length is going to change as we move, and the tension within the muscle actually stays the same. All right, review question 3. A condition of rapid contraction with only partial relaxation is called incomplete tetanus, complete tetanus, twitch, or treppe. All right, the correct answer for this one is an incomplete tetanus. The key word there was partial relaxation, so that keys you into incomplete tetanus. If it said no relaxation, then complete tetanus would be correct. A twitch is just one brief one, whereas incomplete tetanus is a series building on each other. And then treppe is somewhat similar to incomplete tetanus in terms of the contractions building on one another. But in treppe, it's due to the calcium buildup, not the only partial relaxation. All right, now we're going to talk about our energy sources for contraction. And so ATP is the key energy source. Our muscles need ATP, but we only keep enough ATP stored to go through it in a few seconds. So we can't rely on just our stored ATP to power us. So we kind of have to be making it constantly. And there's multiple systems that do this. Okay, so I think the diagram on page 160 of your book is a good visual for this. So if you want to follow along there, I would recommend that. So you see in your diagram, he's just sitting on the step resting. So he's mainly burning fatty acids right now for ATP. And so this is done aerobically. So this is considered aerobic respiration, and that just means that we are utilizing oxygen. So once we start to exercise, we go through our ATP stores in seconds. So our next system is our creatine phosphate system. So this is from the first 20 seconds to minute, depending on how intense the exercise is. And so that basically is the next system once the oxygen supply drops. Oops, sorry. Okay, so glucose, you have we use our glucose system for our longer and usually moderate activity in terms of intensity wise. So it's going to start off as anaerobic, meaning it's not utilizing oxygen. And the penalty for that is that we produce lactic acid. And the buildup of lactic acid is what causes muscle fatigue. And that lasts for about 10 minutes. And then our heart and lungs finally kind of catch up and they can supply enough oxygen for the muscles to start aerobically breaking down glucose. So we still break down glucose pretty much the whole time after that first minute, but we start off breaking it down anaerobically. That equals lactic acid buildup. And then after about 10 minutes, once our oxygen supplies catch back up, then we return to aerobic respiration of glucose, and there is not lactic acid produced when we are using oxygen. Okay, so this one hopefully will be an easy question since we just talked about it, but at rest, muscles obtain most of their energy by metabolizing what? So the correct answer there is D, fatty acids. And so muscles break down that creatine phosphate at the very beginning of exercise. That's after, or kind of as soon as we start our exercise. Lactic acid is the byproduct of the anaerobic respiration of glucose, but fatty acids we break down aerobically at rest. Okay, now we're going to get into muscle function itself. And so our skeletal muscles work in groups to create movement. So rarely do we have just one singular muscle working. They usually work in teams. But the main muscle causing the movement is the prime mover. And so you have your prime mover, and then all the synergists are the muscles that are helping the prime mover with its action. And then the muscles that do the opposite or that are balancing that movement are known as your antagonists. The other thing I wanted to point out in this picture is you see origin and insertion. So your origin tends to be the fixed end of the muscle, while the insertion tends to be the end that moves towards the origin when the muscle is doing its action. So in general, when our muscles contract, the insertion gets closer to the origin. Okay, here's an example that talks through the prime mover. So it uses your elbow again. So when your elbow flexes or when you bend your elbow up, your biceps brachii is your prime mover. This pulls the forearm up. Your tricep straightens your elbow out, so it relaxes. That's known as your antagonist. And then when we go to straighten the elbow out, the roles reverse. So your tricep becomes your prime mover and straightening the elbow out. And your biceps, which bends your elbow, is now the antagonist, so it relaxes. Okay, so everything up to this point, you guys should really study and know well. You should also know this slide just in terms of knowing that muscles are classified differently, or there's different ways to classify muscles. But as I said in the very beginning of the PowerPoint, I don't expect you guys to memorize every single muscle that we go over. So I'm going to talk you through it and walk you through it in terms of all the different muscles that are highlighted in the chapter, but I do not expect you to memorize this. I just like the bones, you should just be familiar enough to understand the general location of the muscles in the body and recognize what may be grouped together a little bit. Okay, so the muscles of the head and neck, all of these guys are your different facial muscles. And so they help you do your expressions. And then you have a couple here, your masseter and your buccinator. They're actually muscles that we use for chewing. We use our temporalis for chewing too. But a lot of these are facial expression and chewing. And then if you move down to the neck, you have your sternocleidomastoid, which goes from kind of the base of your skull to your collarbone. And you have your trapezius, which is the muscle that shrugs your shoulder up. So these are some important muscles for breathing. It's your external and internal intercostals, and they are two different layers that kind of run between the ribs. And then your big breathing muscle is the diaphragm. And so when it gets bigger in our thoracic cavity, it triggers us to take a breath in. Looking a little more superficial in the abdominals, you have your transversus, which is a pretty deep muscle. And so that helps compress and hold all the contents of our abdomen in. Your internal and external obliques, they help your trunk turn side to side, and they help with breathing a little bit too. They can turn your waist a little bit too. And then your rectus abdominis, that's your large kind of 6-pack, 8-pack muscle that when people talk about their abs, that's what they're usually talking about. Looking at the shoulder and upper arm, you have your deltoid is your primary shoulder muscle. It has 3 different sections, anterior, lateral, and posterior. You have your pectoralis major, that's your big chest muscle. There's also a pec minor that makes up that group. And then here's your serratus anterior, and it runs against your ribs, and it's known as your boxer's muscle. So it kind of does a punching motion. All right, so this is the back of the skull and the back. There's that trapezius that we saw in the face and neck slide. So we could see the upper portion. There's also a middle and a lower portion. Down here, this really broad muscle is your latissimus dorsi, your lat, and it runs all the way up to the inside of your arm. It does a lot of pulling motions. And then I want to highlight these guys over here too. These are your rotator cuff muscles, or 3 of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. First, remember it's rotator cuff with an F, not your rotator cup. And your rotator cuff is not actually a muscle, but a muscle group. So it's made up of 4 different muscles. 3 of them are on the back. Let's see, the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, and the teres minor. And then on the front of the shoulder blade is a muscle known as your subscapularis, and that's the 4th rotator cuff muscle. And so the way to remember these is your sits muscles, S-I-T-S is the first letter for each 4, but a super important group to stabilize the shoulder. Okay, moving a little farther down the arm, you have your brachialis. That helps a lot with your biceps and moving the forearm in general. You have your actual biceps here. That's on the front, bend your elbow up. Your triceps is behind the arm, and that straightens your elbow out primarily. Your brachioradialis, we call that one your drinking muscle, because if you make a drinking motion, that's the action your brachioradialis does. You can kind of see it popping off your forearm. And then your pronator muscle allows you to turn your arm or palm to the ground or down. And there's also a supinator muscle that helps you turn it facing up. All right, the thigh has a lot going on here. So just to walk you through it, like I said, do not worry about memorizing these guys. Your sartorius is known as your seatbelt muscle because of the shape, really long and skinny. Your iliopsoas is your hip flexor group, and that's actually 2 different muscles. And interesting enough, your psoas is one of the only muscles that actually connects your trunk to your leg. You have the adductor group here that pulls your thighs in towards each other. And then here they have 3 out of the 4 quadriceps muscles labeled. So they're missing the vastus intermedius. But your quads are the main extender for your knee. They're the most powerful muscle in the body. Your quads are. So you should know that the quads are the most powerful muscle in the body. And so they're called your quads because it's a group of four muscles that makes it up. All right, now we're at the back of the hip. You have your glutes. There's three different glute muscles, medius, maximus, and then minimus is also kind of over on the side and not shown in the picture. And then the other one to know back here is your hamstring group. So that only has three muscles. Your biceps femoris runs to the outside or the lateral portion of your knee, while your semimembranosus and semitendinosus wrap and attach into the front of the knee. So their primary job is to bend your knee, but they do a few other things for the hip too. So your gastrocnemius is your large calf muscle. So that's what you think of when people talk about their calves. Then you also have your soleus, which is a deeper muscle. And both of these do plantar flexion or that gas pedal motion, and they run into the Achilles tendon, which is a super long and strong tendon. So your gastroc works more with your knee extended or when your knee is straight, while your soleus does that motion primarily when your knee is bent. On the front half, the big muscle that runs down the side of your shin is your tibialis anterior. It helps dorsiflex the foot. It gets a little bit of help from your extensor digitorum longus, which runs down and it actually lifts your toes up towards you and helps to push your ankle out laterally, known as eversion. Okay, this is a spot I was saying definitely pay attention to. You should not be trying to memorize pages 162 to 173. So those I'd like you to review, be aware of them, but I will not test you in depth by any means about individual muscles. Like I said, the one thing to remember is that your quads are the most powerful muscle group. And as I said, be at least a little familiar with the location of muscles within the body, but do not try to memorize every single one. So really focus on the first 2/3 of this PowerPoint where we're going over the physiology of things.